My name is Sarah Park. I am 52 years old. I was sitting at my mother's 75th birthday dinner in a restaurant in Old Town San Diego when a man I had never met walked across the room, shook my hand, and told my brother that the negotiation simulation my brother had just paid $800 to practice at a leadership conference had been built from data that came out of my career. My brother looked at me the way people look at a sign they have been driving past for years without reading. I was drinking green tea at the time. I did not look back at him. My brother had been telling people for 30 years that I spent my career talking to crazy people on phone calls. His version of my work, delivered to coworkers and neighbors and golf partners and anyone who asked, was that his little sister was a kind of customer service specialist with unusual clients. She handles crisis calls, he would say. Talks people down. It is actually not that different from what we do in business, he would say. You just have to find their pressure point. I had successfully resolved 23 hostage situations over 8 years. I had sat on the phone at 3 a.m. while a man with 2 sleeping children stood on a bridge in the rain. My brother thought I worked in a call center. This is what happened in the years before that dinner. This is what happened in the room after it. And this is the thing I figured out somewhere in the middle of all of it that I did not know I needed to say out loud until a stranger said it for me. I grew up in San Diego. My father came from Busan and my mother came from Incheon, and they met at a church social in National City in the spring of 1971 and decided within 4 months that they were going to build something together. My father was a Finnish carpenter. My mother ran an alterations shop out of the back room of a dry cleaner on Euclid Avenue for 22 years. They were small and precise people who did not believe in wasting words. I inherited that from them. My brother Kevin did not. Kevin is 4 years older than I am. He was the kind of teenager who came home with a presentation ready when he wanted something from our parents. He was the kind of student who had his entire college application prepared a year early and who told our parents at the dinner table with a printed outline that he intended to attend a business school on the East Coast and that the return on that investment, compared to a state school, was approximately 43% higher based on median salary data at 10-year intervals. He was 16 when he gave that presentation. My parents sat there and listened to the whole thing, and then my mother said, "Kevin, eat your soup before it gets cold," and that was the end of it. He got in, he went. He came back 4 years later with a degree and a seriousness about himself that he has carried ever since, like a briefcase he never sets down. I was not that kind of person. I was the kind of teenager who sat in the back of the room and watched. I was the kind of student who finished her work fast and then spent the rest of the class period paying attention to the other students, not in a nosy way. In the way that some people look at a window and see glass, and some people look at a window and see what is on the other side. I was always looking at what was on the other side. I joined the San Diego Police Department when I was 24. My parents were proud and confused in roughly equal measure. My mother pressed my uniform the morning of my first day and did not say much, and then pulled me to her at the door and held on for longer than she usually did. My father shook my hand. Kevin sent a card that said congratulations and also, "Are you sure?" which is the most Kevin thing that has ever happened to me. My first 3 years were patrol. I worked out of the Southeastern Division, and I drove the same 4 square miles 6 nights a week, and I learned things about a neighborhood that you can only learn by being in it in the dark for a long time. I was not a spectacular officer. I was a steady one. I did not make dramatic arrests or get commendations for courage under fire. What I did was show up, pay attention, and not create problems. My sergeant at the time was a woman named Lieutenant Gloria Hicks, and she had been on the force for 26 years, and she had the particular competence of someone who has stopped trying to prove anything to anyone. She watched me for about a year, and then one day she called me into her office and told me there was a position opening in the crisis negotiation unit, and she thought I should apply. I said I did not think I had the right background. She said the background they were looking for was not about background. She said it was about a specific kind of patience that most people do not have. She said she had watched me on a domestic call 3 weeks prior. The husband had been drunk and loud, and the wife had been very quiet and very still, in the particular way that people are still when they have been frightened into stillness over a long period of time. She said most officers in that situation focus on the loud thing. She said I had focused on the quiet thing. She said the unit needed people who could hear the quiet thing. I applied. I trained for 11 months. I passed every assessment, and failed one personality evaluation and was told that the evaluator's concern was that I was too controlled, meaning that in high-pressure role-play scenarios, I did not exhibit sufficient emotional activation to connect with subjects. What they meant was that I did not perform urgency convincingly when the scene called for it. I went back to Lieutenant Hicks and told her what they said. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she called someone at the unit and said that the evaluation was wrong, and that controlled was exactly the right word, and that controlled was what they needed. I was cleared 3 weeks later. My back started hurting in my 3rd year with the unit. Crisis negotiation is done from a specific kind of posture. You are in a cramped operation space, usually a van or a converted room at the scene, leaning forward over a phone or a radio, shoulders rounded, neck bent, for hours at a time. Some calls lasted 40 minutes, some lasted 8 hours. My body learned to hold itself in that shape, and then it stopped being able to easily leave that shape. The pain is not dramatic. It is a low constant pressure across the lower lumbar and a tightness in the thoracic region that flares when I lift anything heavier than a bag of groceries. I also have a bad left knee from a slip on wet pavement in my patrol years, a nothing injury that I did not bother to report properly because it happened at the end of a shift and I was tired, and the cartilage never quite healed the way it should have. I have a surgical scar on that knee that is about 3 inches long and mostly invisible under my clothing. I mention these things because they are part of the story. The work goes in the body. You do not come out of it entirely the same shape you went in. My marriage ended in my 6th year on the unit. My ex-husband's name was Daniel, and he was a good man, and none of what happened between us was vicious or dramatic. It simply could not hold the weight of what the work required. I left at all hours. I came home at all hours. I could not talk about where I had been or what I had done. Not because of regulations, though regulations did apply, because the people I sat on the phone with in the worst hours of their lives had a right to those hours being private. They had not consented to become dinner conversation. They had not agreed to be discussed over wine at the end of a long day. I was the only one who carried what happened in those calls, which meant I was the only one who got to decide when and whether they ever came out of me. The answer was almost never, and Daniel needed more than almost never. We divorced when our daughter Clara was 4 years old, and we have remained on reasonable terms ever since, and Clara has grown up knowing roughly what I did without knowing the specifics, which is the arrangement I think is right. Clara is 22 years old now. She is studying social work at San Diego State, and she has her grandfather's precision with words and her grandmother's ability to hold still. She is the person in my life who sees most clearly, and she does it without making a production of it, which is the thing I admire most about her. The 23 cases span 8 years. I am not going to describe them because they are not mine to describe. Each one involves a person who was in the worst moment of their life and who reached a place that felt like a ledge and who was, for a window of time, connected only by a wire and a voice to someone who was going to decide whether they mattered. I was that someone on 23 occasions. I take no particular credit for the outcomes. The outcomes belong to the people on the other end of the phone. What I did was stay. That is all. I stayed on the line, and I meant it every single time, and the meaning is the whole thing. After my 8th year on the unit, I transferred to training. I spent 5 years training negotiators at the regional level and consulting on methodology. My name appears in several published training documents and in 2 peer-reviewed articles in law enforcement journals. I am aware that my brother has never read a law enforcement journal, and I am also aware that this is not a character flaw. People read the things that are relevant to them. I simply do not appear in the things Kevin reads. And so, for 30 years, I have not appeared to him at all. When I left the department, I started a consulting practice. I teach communication skills to corporations, conflict de-escalation, high-pressure conversation management. I work with hospital systems and legal departments and human resources teams, and I am very good at it, and it pays more than I ever made as a lieutenant. Clara calls it giving people the short version of what you know. I have told her that is not unfair. The dinner at Rosario's was Kevin's idea. It is always Kevin's idea. My mother does not ask for much in the way of organized celebration, and Kevin is very good at organizing celebration. So birthdays, holidays, and milestones in our family have for many years looked like Kevin's vision of what those events should look like. This is not a criticism. He is good at it. He calls the restaurant, he picks the flowers, he selects the menu option, he coordinates who arrives when. He also organizes the seating, which is how I ended up next to Kevin's friend Jim for the entire first course. I arrived at 5:48. Our reservation was at 6:30. I am always early, and I have been early my entire life, and it is the thing about me that my daughter finds most endearing and my former colleagues found most predictable. I checked the room the way I always check rooms, which is a habit I cannot turn off. I noted the exits. I noted the layout of the tables and the positioning of the waitstaff and the ambient noise level. I sat at the bar and ordered water and looked at my phone. My back was already hurting from the drive. Clara arrived at 6 to 10 and found me at the bar and sat down next to me without saying anything for a moment. She looked at the way I was sitting. She said, "Bad day." I said, "It is fine." She said, "Is the back thing or the anticipation thing?" I said, "Both, probably." She ordered a sparkling water, and we sat together for a few minutes, and it was the quietest and most comfortable part of the entire evening. The family arrived in waves. Kevin and Linda came at 6:20 with Kevin's two sons, Marcus and Tyler, who are 17 and 14, and who are good boys doing the best they can with a father who presents agendas at family dinners. Kevin's colleagues, Jim and Patty, arrived shortly after, which I noted with the particular wariness I always feel when Kevin brings his work friends to family events. Jim sells commercial real estate in Carlsbad. Patty is his wife, and she is actually quite funny and makes the evening considerably more tolerable by being willing to laugh at things that are genuinely amusing. My mother arrived at 6:26, which is to say 4 minutes early, which is to say on time in our family. She was wearing a blue dress she had altered herself, and her hair was done, and she looked the way she looks on days when she has decided to be fully present for something. She came through the door and saw Clara and went straight to her and held her face in both hands for a moment, the way she does with the people she loves most. She came to me next. She touched my arm and said, "You're back." I said, "It is fine, Mom." She looked at me for an extra second in the way mothers look when they have decided to let something go. We went to the table. The first 40 minutes of dinner were fine. The bread was good. The soup was very good. My mother and Patty talked about a television series they both watch. Clara and Tyler discovered a shared interest in competitive gaming of some kind and had an animated conversation about something I did not understand. Marcus spent most of dinner looking at his phone with the practiced invisibility of a teenage boy who has mastered the art of being in a room without appearing to participate in it. Kevin talked to Jim about a commercial property deal in the East Village, and I ate my soup and did not need to be anyone in particular for about 35 minutes. Then Kevin mentioned the conference. It came up naturally enough. Jim asked Kevin how the week had been, and Kevin said, "Actually, excellent. I was at a leadership summit at the Marriott downtown." And Jim said, "How was it?" And Kevin said, "Honestly, it was one of the better professional development experiences I have had in recent memory." From there, it was a gradual thing, the way a small fire is a gradual thing. A comment became an explanation. An explanation became a story. A story became a full debrief delivered to a captive table. The summit had been 2 days of workshops on organizational leadership, communication frameworks, decision-making under pressure. Kevin had paid $1,200 of his own money to attend it and was going to get his value from it one way or another, which I understood and did not begrudge him. He is a thorough person. When Kevin learns something, he needs to teach it back in order to believe it. That is how his mind works. I have known this about him for 40 years. He talked about a presenter who had frameworks for what he called decisive communication. The core of the framework, as Kevin described it, was the idea that most communication failures in business happen because people are too invested in being understood and not invested enough in making a decision. The presenter's argument was that clarity and authority are the primary tools of any negotiation or confrontation, and that warmth and empathy, while not worthless, are secondary considerations that professionals deploy strategically rather than genuinely. I listened to this and refilled my tea. Kevin described a second workshop on what the conference called adversarial conversation management. The premise was that in any high-stakes conversation, someone is trying to win and someone is trying not to lose, and the goal of a skilled communicator is to identify which role they are playing and then optimize accordingly. The presenter had apparently been a former federal agent of some kind, which Kevin mentioned twice. I cut a piece of my chicken and ate it. Kevin talked for about 12 minutes about the negotiation simulation. This is the part I want to describe accurately because it matters to what came later. The simulation, as Kevin described it, was a scenario in which participants had to talk a role-playing actor out of a crisis situation, specifically an actor positioned on a rooftop ledge, making statements that suggested suicidal intent. Participants were given a brief, a set of guidelines, and 3 minutes to prepare. They were then assessed on communication effectiveness, resolution speed, and something called leverage identification, which appeared to mean the degree to which the participant successfully identified what the subject wanted and offered a version of it as a transactional incentive. Kevin had apparently been assessed as one of the top performers in his session. The facilitator had told him afterward that his identification of the actor's stated need for acknowledgement and his delivery of a structured concession around that need was textbook. Kevin used the word textbook. He was happy about this. Kevin looked at me about midway through this part of the story. He said, "You probably know all about that, right, Sarah, from your crisis phone work?" He said it in the particular way that people say things to me about my career that assume they already know what the career was and are only checking in as a courtesy. I said, "A little, yes." He said, "It is actually more applicable to business than people realize." He said, "The methodology translates almost perfectly to high-stakes sales conversations and contract negotiations." He said, "The psychology is the same. You are just finding the pressure point and meeting it." I said, "The psychology is a little different." He said, "How so?" I said, "In business, you can walk away. The conversation can end and everyone comes back to it the next day. The stakes are recalibrated. Time absorbs some of the pressure. In the situations I worked, the conversation was the only thing standing between the person and a permanent decision. You do not walk away. You do not recalibrate. You stay on the line until the situation is resolved." Kevin considered this for a moment. Then he said, "Right, but the toolkit is the same. Listen, acknowledge, identify the need, meet the need." He said, "That is what we practiced." I said, "The toolkit looks similar from the outside." He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means that the tools look the same, but the thing powering them is different." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "Okay, the Zen master speaks." He said it with affection, I think. He turned back to Jim and continued talking about the conference. Clara looked at me. I looked at my plate. After the main course, Kevin turned to Jim and made a longer argument about the value of professional development programs for executives. And at some point during this argument, he made a remark about the way organizations tend to undervalue the skill sets associated with what he called support roles. He did not look at me when he said this. He did not mean it as a remark about me. He was making a general point about organizational structures and the tendency of corporations to compensate prestige over utility. But the thing about living inside a particular characterization for 30 years is that you start to feel its edges clearly, even when the person delivering it has no awareness that they are delivering it. I am the support role in Kevin's understanding of the world. I have been the support role since I was 24 years old and chose a career that requires no portfolio and produces no visible metrics, and whose outcomes are, by the nature of the work, confidential and private and not available for presentation at dinners. Kevin has a business card that says his title on it. Kevin has a regional sales record. Kevin has a track record of decisions that can be pointed to and evaluated and compared. I have 23 resolved cases that belong to 23 people who are alive, and I have an internal document in a file in a locked server in the San Diego Police Department, and I have the specific quality of sleep that comes from having stayed on the phone at 3 in the morning and meant it. Kevin cannot see any of that. I went outside after the main course. The street in Old Town was warm and beginning to fill up with the evening crowd. A tourist group was moving down the block with a guide. A mariachi band was setting up in the square. I stood outside the door of the restaurant with my hands in the pockets of my jacket and my back aching at about a 6 out of 10, and I breathed the warm evening air for a few minutes. My phone had a message from a former colleague named Diane who had been at a training I ran last month for the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. She said it had been cited in their new protocol framework. She said the lieutenant who attended had called it the most practically applicable training the department had received in 5 years. She said, "Congratulations." I wrote back, "Thank you. Glad it was useful." I put my phone in my pocket. I stood there for a moment longer. I want to be honest about what I was feeling. Because the easy version of this story is that Kevin's dismissal of my career was a wound that I carried quietly for 30 years, and that the dinner was the moment it finally surfaced and was healed. That version is cleaner and more satisfying, and it is not quite accurate. The accurate version is that I had made a decision at some point in the middle of my career. I had decided that the validation I needed, I had already received. I had received it from Lieutenant Hicks, who saw something in me worth redirecting. I had received it from the team at the unit, who trusted me with the situations they trusted to me. I had received it from the people on the other end of 23 phone calls, whose names I know and will never use in any version of this story. I had received it from Diane's message on my phone. I had received it from the evaluations at training sessions I have run in the last 7 years, from the practitioners who have told me that what I gave them changed the way they do their work. I did not need Kevin to give it to me. I had not needed Kevin to give it to me for a long time. What I was feeling outside the restaurant was not primarily grief or anger. What I was feeling was something more like the low-grade tiredness of having to carry a particular kind of silence for 30 years. Not the silence about the cases. That silence is right, and I would carry it for 30 more years without complaint. The other silence, the one where I watched my brother describe my career to people and I let it be described that way because correcting it would have required me to claim something, and claiming things is not how I was raised and not how I do it. Clara came outside. She stood next to me. She said, "You're back," or the Kevin thing. I said, "Both. Mostly just the evening air." She said, "He means well." I said, "I know." She said, "That is not really an excuse, is it?" I said, "No, but it is a fact." We stood there for a minute. A couple walked past us, the man carrying a sleeping child over his shoulder, the child's head hanging loose with the total trust of deep sleep. Clara watched them go by. She turned back to the street. She said, "You ready to go back in?" I said, "Give me another minute." She gave me another minute, and then we went back in. The dessert had been prearranged by Kevin, which is to say that a fixed dessert menu had been selected in advance and was going to arrive regardless of whether any individual at the table was in the mood for chocolate lava cake. I was not in the mood for chocolate lava cake. I drank my tea and let the conversation flow around me and watched my mother talk to Patty and thought about what I was going to do the next morning, which was teach a half-day session to a pharmaceutical company's regional sales managers on communication under uncertainty. I thought about the opening exercise I was planning to use. I thought about the particular kind of attention I would need to hold for 4 hours and whether my back was going to cooperate. I was thinking about all of this when a man stopped at the edge of our table. He was somewhere between 50 and 55. He was wearing a blazer over a dress shirt with no tie, the deliberate casualness of someone who presents professionally and has thought about how to look approachable while still looking authoritative. He was carrying a glass of white wine, and he had the posture of someone who spends a great deal of time in front of rooms. He looked at me, and then he looked at the table, and then he looked at me again with the specific quality of a person who has recognized someone they were not expecting to see. My mother looked up at him. She has the instinct of a person who ran a service business for 22 years, which means she is always the first to register a new presence. The man said, "I am sorry to interrupt." He looked at me. He said, "You are Sarah Park." I said, "Former Lieutenant Park." "Yes." He said, "I thought so. I read the methodology piece in the Criminal Justice Training Review in 2017. There was a photograph. He introduced himself. His name was Victor Sloan. He did crisis communication training for corporate and institutional clients. He had been at a corporate dinner event in the private room at the back of the restaurant and had recognized me when he passed our table on the way to the bar. Kevin said, "Can I help you?" He said it not rudely, but with the polite territorialism of the person who organized the dinner and was being interrupted during it. Victor looked at Kevin. He said, "Are you family?" Kevin said, "Her brother, Kevin Park." Victor said, "Kevin Park." He looked at him for a moment. He said, "Were you at the leadership summit at the Marriott this week?" Kevin said, "Yes, actually." My mother said, "Please, sit for a moment." She pulled out the chair next to her. Victor thanked her and sat down. He asked Kevin what workshop track he had attended. Kevin described the negotiation and communication track. Victor asked if Kevin had done the crisis scenario simulation on the second morning. Kevin said yes, The ledge scenario. Victor nodded. He asked Kevin how it had gone. Kevin said, actually pretty well. He described his performance in the way he had described it at dinner. Leverage identification. Structured concession. He used the word textbook again. Victor listened to this. He nodded in a specific way, the way a teacher nods when a student answers correctly and is about to tell them what part of the answer they are missing. He said, that is good. He said, the scenario you practiced is not a classroom construction. He said, it is based on a real case. Kevin said, right, they mentioned that. He said, they said the methodology was drawn from real police data. Victor said, more specifically than that. He turned and looked at me. He said, the ledge scenario used in that training was built from case file 11 in the San Diego CNU archive. Your sister held the phone on that call for 4 hours and 14 minutes. The subject had called 4 different crisis lines before she got on the line. He had ended each previous call by going silent, and the line workers had flagged it as a disconnection and handed off. She knew from the pattern that silence was not disconnection. She stayed on the line through 42 minutes of silence until he spoke again. Kevin was looking at Victor. Victor said, she resolved 23 situations over 8 years with the San Diego Police Department. I have been using her case data as the foundation of my corporate negotiation training programs since 2018. Every scenario you practiced this week was drawn from her real caseload. The reason your facilitator could tell you the methodology has a real-world basis is because it does. That basis is your sister. There was a silence. Kevin looked at me. I was lifting my teacup. I did not look at him. The silence lasted about 6 seconds. I know how to measure silence. 6 seconds is a long time at a dinner table. Victor said, I apologize for interrupting the dinner. He looked at my mother and said, happy birthday. He looked at me and said, I have wanted to tell you in person for several years that your work matters to the field. He stood up, thanked my mother again, nodded to the table, and walked back toward the private dining room. The table was quiet for a moment longer. Kevin's wife, Linda, was looking at her fork. Jim was looking at his water glass. Patty was looking at Kevin. Clara was looking at me. My mother was looking at the middle distance with the expression she has had my entire life when something has happened that she has decided to absorb before she says anything about it. Marcus looked up from his phone. He said, wait, what just happened? Kevin said, nothing. He refilled his wine glass. He said, nothing. We are having dessert. The chocolate lava cakes arrived. My mother talked about the television show again. Patty asked Clara about her graduate school plans. Tyler and Marcus finished their desserts with the focused efficiency of teenage boys who were ready to be somewhere with their phones. Kevin ate his cake and said nothing for about 15 minutes, which is the longest I have seen Kevin go without speaking at a family dinner in recent memory. I watched him. Not continuously. I have learned over many years not to watch people the way they can feel themselves being watched. I watched him in the peripheral way, the way you monitor a situation without monitoring the situation he was processing. He was doing it in his particular way, which is to say alone and with a certain amount of effortful stillness that did not look effortless at all. The birthday cake was a different cake. Kevin had also prearranged this one. It was a vanilla chiffon cake with the Korean calligraphy for longevity written in red icing on the top. He had commissioned it from a bakery in Koreatown in LA and driven it down the morning of the dinner, which he had not mentioned to anyone. My mother looked at it and pressed both hands against her mouth for a moment, just for a moment. Then she took her hands away and said, Kevin, this is very beautiful. We sang. My mother sat very straight and her eyes were bright, and she blew out 75 candles, one for each year, while everyone counted. Clara helped with the last few. My mother laughed. Genuinely, in the way she laughs when she has forgotten to be careful about laughing. We ate the cake. It was very good cake. Kevin's boys said goodnight to my mother and to Clara and went to wait by Kevin's car with the graceful disappearance of teenagers who have fulfilled their social obligation. Jim and Patty said their goodbyes to my mother and kissed her cheek and told her she looked wonderful, and she did. They left. Kevin and Linda began gathering things at the other end of the table. My mother and Clara were talking. I put on my jacket. My back made the specific complaint it makes at the end of a long evening, the low, grinding pressure that I have learned to breathe through. Kevin appeared next to me. He said, "My coat is at the check." He was not going for his coat. He stood there. I waited. He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know." He said, "I mean, I knew what you did. I knew the job. I just didn't know." I said, "It's all right." He said, "It's not, actually." I looked at him. He was looking at the floor, and then he looked at me, and his face had the particular discomfort of a person who has just had their understanding of something rearranged and is not yet sure how to hold the new arrangement. He said, "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Not accusations, genuinely asking. I said, "It wasn't mine to say." He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "The people I talked to, every one of them, that was their worst night, their worst moment. When you are in that moment, you do not give consent for anyone to use it later. They called because they had run out of everything else. I was the last thing they were willing to try. What they said on those calls belongs to them. It was never mine to take out and show people." He said, "But you could have told me, generally, the numbers, that there were 23. I said, "Would it have changed anything?" He did not answer that for a moment. He said, "I told people you worked in a call center." I said, "I know." He said, "I said it was not that different from customer service with difficult clients. I said that to people multiple times." I said, "I know." He said, "I was being dismissive and I didn't even know I was doing it." I said, "Kevin, I said it the way you say someone's name when you want them to stop flogging themselves and hear what you are actually saying." He looked up. I said, "I know you didn't know. I did not need you to know. The people who needed to know what I did already knew. The people I trained, the colleagues I worked with, the departments I consulted for, that was enough. I did not need it to also be the thing that came out at family dinners." He said, "But I was wrong." I said, "Yes?" He said, "And I made you smaller than you are for 30 years. I said, "You made a story about me that fit the information you had. The information was incomplete because I kept it incomplete. That is not entirely on you." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I talked about leverage." He said, "In that simulation, finding the pressure point and meeting it." I said, "I know. I was there." He said, "Is that..." He stopped. He started again. He said, "Is that how it actually works? The pressure point and the concession?" I said, "No." He said, "Then how?" I said, "You stay on the line. That is the whole thing. You decide that you are going to stay on the line for as long as it takes, and you mean it. The person on the other end knows, somehow, whether you mean it. They cannot tell you how they know, but they know. And if you mean it, if you genuinely mean it, if you actually believe that the person on the other end of the phone is worth every hour it takes, then most of the time they stay too. Not always, but most of the time." He said, "That sounds simple." I said, "It is the hardest thing I know how to do." He said, "What is the hard part?" I said, "Believing it. Every time. Call 11, call 19, call 23. Coming back to the belief from scratch each time that this particular person, in this particular moment, is worth the hours. Not performing the belief, actually having it." Kevin was quiet. I put on my second glove. I said, "I'm going to get my car before the lot fills up." He said, "Sarah." I stopped. He said, "I'm sorry." Not as a transaction. Not as a way to close the conversation. Just, "I'm sorry." 30 years. I looked at him. He looked like someone who had just been told that a building he had been walking past his whole life was actually a cathedral, and he was trying to decide how to feel about all the years he had walked past it without going in. I said, "Kevin, you've been organizing our mother's birthdays for 20 years. You drove a cake from Los Angeles this morning. That counts for something." He said, "It is not the same thing." I said, "No, but it counts." I said goodnight to my mother. She held my face in her hands the way she does and looked at me for a moment without speaking. She has a way of doing this that communicates everything without using any words, which I think I got from her. She said, "You drive carefully." I said, "I will, Mom." Claire and I left together. We walked to the parking lot, and I unlocked the Crown Vic, and we got in. Clara has been telling me for 2 years to replace the Crown Vic. It is 12 years old and has over 200,000 miles on it, and the passenger window does not go all the way down anymore, and the heat takes about 6 minutes to actually become warm. I am not going to replace it. It has never given me a reason to not trust it, and I do not replace things that have not given me a reason to not trust them. Clara put on her seatbelt and looked at the roof of the car for a moment. She said, "Victor Sloan." I said, "Yes." She said, "He just walked over and did that." I said, "Yes." She said, "What do you think of him?" I said, "I think he is a good teacher who has a strong sense of occasion." Clara laughed. It was a real laugh. It echoed a little in the old car. We drove for a while. The streets in Old Town were still bright with evening people. I took the long way out of the parking lot and turned onto the main road, and the city opened up around us with its specific version of late evening, the lights and the warm dark and the particular San Diego sky that is never entirely dark because there is always something reflecting in it. Clara said, "Uncle Kevin looked like someone pulled the floor out from under him." I said, "He processed it." She said, "Do you think it will stick?" I said, "I think some of it will." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Are you glad it happened?" I sat with that for a moment. I said, "I am not sure glad is the right word." I said, "I think it was the right thing. I think there is a version of the next 30 years that is better because it happened. Whether I am glad about the specific way it happened, with Victor Sloan and the dinner and all of it, I am not sure." She said, "It was a little dramatic." I said, "Yes." She said, "You were so calm." I said, "I have had some practice." She smiled at that. She turned and looked out the window. She said, "He asked you the right question, I think, at the end." I said, "Which question?" She said, "What the hard part is." She said, "I have never actually asked you that. I have always assumed I knew." I said, "What did you assume?" She said, "I assumed the hard part was the outcomes, the times when it did not go the right way." I said, "Those are a different kind of hard. They exist. I carry them, but they are not the hardest part." She said, "The believing it." I said, "Yes. Coming back to the belief from scratch. Making it new each time, not performing it. That is the thing that costs something. After 23 calls, the belief is not a habit. It is not automatic. Each time, you have to arrive at it again from the beginning. You have to look at the situation and decide, fresh, that this person in this moment matters enough to give them the hours. If you are performing the belief, they know. If you are genuinely arriving at it, they know that too." Clara did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think that is why you are good at the corporate training?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You make the people in the room believe they are worth the hours. The way you look at them, the way you listen. I came to one of your sessions once, in my second year of undergrad, the hospital one, and I watched you, and I thought, she is doing the same thing. She is doing it with a room of 40 people instead of one person on a phone, but she is doing the same thing." I had not thought about it in exactly those terms. I thought about it for a moment. I said, "Maybe." She said, "That is not a maybe." I said, "All right, not a maybe." We drove the rest of the way home in a companionable quiet. The city moved past the windows. My back ached at about a 4 now, which was better. My knee was fine. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine and sat for a moment in the dark of the car. I thought about case 11. 4 hours and 14 minutes. 42 minutes of silence. The specific quality of that silence, which I had recognized from the pattern and which I had stayed inside without trying to fill it. There is a pressure to fill silence. It is one of the strongest instincts people have in a conversation, and it is almost always wrong in a crisis. The silence was not emptiness. The silence was processing. The silence was the person on the other end trying to find a way back. You do not fill that. You hold it. You hold it and you mean it and you let them find their way inside of it. He found his way, I drove home at 5:40 in the morning, and I was in bed by 6, and I was back at the precinct by 2 in the afternoon. My then husband was still asleep when I got in. He did not know where I had been. I did not wake him to tell him. I took a shower and I got into bed and I closed my eyes and I thought, it is done. That is how you let it go. You acknowledge it and you release it and you do not pick it up again. The case was resolved. The next case would be different. This one was done. I could not have described any of that to Kevin over a dinner table. Not because it was classified, though some of it was. Because there is no way to describe the quality of that silence to someone who has not sat inside it. There is no way to explain what it costs to stay on the phone for 4 hours, to hold steady in your belief that the person on the other end is worth those hours, without in some way diminishing the experience by putting words to it. It lives in the body. It lives in the particular tiredness of 5:40 in the morning after a long night in a crisis operations room. It is not a story. It is a condition. You either carry it or you do not. I carry it. All 23 of them, and the years of training that came after, and the years of teaching that came after that, and all the people I have tried to give some version of this to, in corporate conference rooms, and hospital auditoriums, and police training centers. I carry it not as a weight, though it is heavy sometimes, but as something I was trusted with. The information that every person, in the worst moment of their life, is worth the hours. I carry that. Kevin called the next morning. He called at 8:47, which is late for Kevin, who generally starts work at 7 and sends emails before 6. I was on my second coffee and looking at my notes for the pharmaceutical session, and when his name came up on my phone, I looked at it for a moment and then I answered. He said, I am going to ask you something and I want you to answer it honestly. I said, all right. He said, is there anything I can do? He meant it broadly. Is there anything I can do to make 30 years of not knowing better? Is there anything I can do now that would matter? Is there anything I owe you that I can actually pay? I said, Kevin, I said, this is not a negotiation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I walked into that one. I said, yes. He laughed a little, just a small one. He said, I want to understand it better. What you did, not the specific cases. I know you can't talk about those, but the work itself, the methodology. I want to understand why the leverage point thing is wrong. I said, it is not that it is wrong. I said, it is that it is incomplete. In a transactional negotiation, leverage and concession are the tools because both parties can walk away. They have fallbacks. There is a floor beneath the conversation. In a crisis situation, one party has no floor. The conversation is the floor. If the conversation ends without resolution, there is nothing beneath it. You cannot leverage someone who has nothing left to lose. You cannot offer a concession to someone who has decided that everything is already lost. The only thing you can offer is the belief that it is not lost. And that belief has to be real. They will know in about 40 seconds whether it is real. He said, how do you know if you have it, if the belief is real and not performed? I said, you feel the difference. When you are performing it, there is a slight effort to it, a monitoring of your own voice. When it is real, there is no monitoring. You are not thinking about yourself at all. You are only thinking about the person. He said, 42 minutes of silence? I said, yes. He said, you just sat there. I said, I was on the line. There is a difference between silence and absence. He was silent. I was present. Kevin was quiet for a moment on his end of the phone. He said, I spent 2 days learning to find the pressure point and offer the concession. And you are telling me the thing that actually works is just being there. I said, it is not just being there. It is choosing to be there. It is deciding that you are going to stay and meaning it so completely that the decision does not need to be remade every few minutes. It holds. And then it holds the other person too, somehow. I do not have a better explanation than that. I have spent years trying to teach it in better language, and I always come back to the same place. You stay. You mean it. That is the whole thing. He said, I think I need to come to one of your workshops. I said, Kevin, you sell commercial real estate. He said, I have difficult conversations all the time. I said, that is true. He said, send me a schedule. I said, I will. We talked for another hour. It was the longest conversation Kevin and I had had since our father's funeral, which was 11 years ago and also in San Diego, also with too many chairs arranged in the wrong configuration, also with Kevin having organized most of the logistics. We talked about our father. We talked about our mother's shop and what it had been like to grow up in the back room of it on the afternoons our mother had worked late. We talked about Kevin's boys in the way that Kevin and I almost never talk about his boys, which is honestly without performance, with the specific love that is available to you when you are not trying to also look like a successful parent while you are talking. At one point, Kevin said, I have been describing you wrong for 30 years. He said it not as a confession, but as a statement of fact. He said, when I said you were in a call center, I meant it as a kind of shorthand. I knew it was not accurate, but it was the version that fit the story I had. I said, what story? He said, the story where I was the one who had the impressive career. He said it quietly, and he said it like someone who had been holding it for a while and had decided it was finally safe to set down. I said, your career is impressive. He said, it is not 23. I said, Kevin, that is not a competition. He said, I know. He said, that is the thing I realized at 3 this morning when I could not sleep. It was never a competition. You were not trying to beat me. You were just doing the work. And I turned it into a competition in my own head, and then I won it by making your side smaller, and the whole time your side was the one doing the thing that actually mattered. I was quiet for a moment. I said, you raised 2 good boys. You have been married to the same person for 26 years, and she still laughs at your jokes. You drove a cake from Los Angeles. Those things matter. He said, yeah. I said, the work is not a trophy, neither of ours. You do it, and then you let it go, and then you do more of it. That is all. He said, yeah. He said it again, more slowly. Yeah. We said goodbye shortly after. He said, I will call next week. I said, I know you will. He said, that is not a criticism, is it? I said, no, Kevin, it is just a fact. I put my phone down and finished my coffee and looked at my notes for the pharmaceutical session. The session went well. It always goes well when I am not thinking about whether it will go well and am instead just thinking about the people in the room. My back hurt for 2 days after the dinner. It always does after an evening in a restaurant chair. I took the anti-inflammatory medication and used the heating pad and slept on the good side, and by Tuesday it was back to a manageable 3 out of 10. The left knee was fine. The knee is almost always fine now. It only complains when there is rain coming, which in San Diego is not often. Clara texted me Monday morning. She said, how are you feeling? I said, good. Back is better. She said, not what I asked. I said, I know. I am good, Clara. She sent back a small red heart and then a message that said, also I looked him up, Victor Sloan. He has a talk on YouTube with 400,000 views. I said, I know. I have seen it. She said, he calls you the benchmark. I said, I know. She said, you watched a YouTube video where someone calls you the benchmark. I said, I did. I found it useful as a teaching tool. She said, you are the most yourself of any person I have ever met. I put my phone down and went to make my terrible coffee, which I make in an old percolator that everyone tells me to replace, and which makes coffee that is too strong and slightly grainy at the bottom of the cup, and which I have been making in this way since I was a detective sergeant and have no intention of changing. I drank my coffee and thought about staying. The thing I have been trying to teach for the last 7 years in pharmaceutical companies and law firms and hospital systems and the occasional police department that will have me is this. The tool is not the word. The word is a vehicle. The tool is the belief behind the word, the belief that the person in front of you is worth your full attention, not your managed attention, not your strategic attention, your full and unreserved and genuine attention, renewed from scratch for this particular person in this particular moment, as if you have never done this before and will not need to do it again. Most people can perform this for about 3 minutes, maybe 6. After that, the performance starts to show. The monitoring creeps back in, the small self-assessments begin. Am I doing well? Is this working? How much longer do I have to sustain this? The performance is available to everyone. The real thing is available to fewer people, and even those people have to work to maintain it past the first few minutes. It is a specific kind of discipline, and it takes specific kinds of practice. The practice is not what people think it is. People think it is a communication skill. They want a framework, steps, something to put in a binder. I give them exercises and techniques because exercises and techniques are useful for the first mile of the journey. But the thing itself is not a technique. It is a decision made fresh every time about the value of another person. It is the decision that the person in front of you is worth the hours, that their situation matters enough to deserve your presence, genuinely, not strategically. I could not have explained this to Kevin at a dinner table. I could not have explained it anywhere that felt like explaining. The explanations are available. They are in the training materials. They are in the professional journals. They are in Victor Sloan's YouTube video, which is actually quite good. But the thing the explanations point toward is only available through the practice of it. And the practice is only available when you believe the thing is worth practicing. Kevin called on Wednesday to confirm that he was coming to the workshop in July. He said he had sent the registration fee. I told him I would refund it. He said, no, you will not. I said, Kevin, he said, I want to pay for it. I said, I am going to give you a discount at least. He said, absolutely not. I said, 50%. He said, no. I said, Kevin? He said, full price, Sarah? Because I spent 30 years not understanding what you were doing, and paying for the workshop is the smallest thing I can think of that cost me something, so let me have it. I said, all right. I said, all right. We hung up, and I sat for a moment with the particular quality of a conversation that has landed somewhere new. My mother called Thursday evening to say she had heard from Kevin and that she was glad. She did not describe what she was glad about. She has never described anything she did not need to describe. She said, you are both my children, and I have always been proud of both of you, and this week I am particularly proud. I said, of Kevin. She said, of both of you. She said, Kevin, because it is hard to be wrong about something for 30 years and say so. You, because it has always been hard to carry things quietly, and you have done it with grace. She said, your father would have been proud too. I said, I know, Mom. She said, come for dinner on Sunday. I said, yes. I put the phone down and looked out the window at the San Diego evening. The sky was doing the thing it does in late spring, where the light takes a long time to go away, where the brightness holds past 8 o'clock and the whole city glows with it. The thing that happened at the dinner did not change what I did for 8 years. It did not change what the 23 people did on 23 nights. It did not change what Case 11 cost or what it gave, what any of them cost or what any of them gave. The cases are complete. They have been complete for years. Nothing at a restaurant table adds to them or takes anything away. What changed was smaller than that and also larger than that. What changed was that my brother is now sitting inside a different understanding of who his sister is. Not because I told him, because a stranger told him, in the particular way that strangers sometimes land information that family cannot. He is sitting inside that understanding and trying to find a way to inhabit it honestly. He is going to come to the workshop and pay full price and sit in a room with pharmaceutical executives and learn something he should have learned from me 30 years ago, and that is fine. That is the version of it that was available. I am going to teach it to him the same way I teach it to everyone, with the full belief that he is worth the hours, because he is. Because everyone in every room I have ever stood in front of is worth the hours. Because that is the whole job and has always been the whole job. Whether the room is a crisis operations van at 2 a.m. or a conference center in downtown San Diego on a Tuesday afternoon, you show up, you stay on the line, you mean it. The art of talking someone down is not about what you say. It is about how long you are willing to stay and how much you genuinely believe that the person on the other end is worth staying for. I believed it every time. 23 times over 8 years, I believed it from scratch, new, as if the belief had never been tested before and was not carrying the weight of every previous time I had needed it. I still believe it. Every room I walk into, every conversation I sit down inside of, every person who picks up the phone in their worst moment, every executive in a binder-covered chair who thinks they are there to learn a technique. They are all worth the hours. Every one of them. I start from that and I work outward, and that is the whole thing. That is everything I know. Stay on the line. Mean it. Let that be enough. It always has been.